All right, hello and welcome everybody. And for anybody who's not attended any of my training sessions before, my name's Mike Thomas. I'm an IT trainer with 30 plus years experience, and I've been a Mac user since 2006. And I'll be taking you through this session on pivot tables on the Mac. Now, if you're familiar with pivot tables on the Windows version of Excel, the good news is that there is a lot of similarities with the Mac version. However, there are a few differences, and not necessarily in a good way. There's a few things missing, but I will show you a few workarounds for those. If you're watching this live, and the recording will be available afterwards, but if you are watching it live, please feel free to put questions and comments into the chat. And so with that, let's get started. And I'm going to start with the basics. Okay, so pivot tables. Here I have a set of data. It's for an imaginary company called the Excellent Ice Cream Company. And they have luxury ice cream parlours and cafes dotted around the US. And this is a list of sales. So they sell their ice cream to their own cafes and parlours, but they also sell their ice cream to other restaurants and other shops. So they act as a supplier as well. So this is the data, this is the sales data for the first 5.5 months of this year. And what I need to do is I need to produce a number of different reports from this data. Now, I can produce those reports without pivot tables. If I just go to this manuals report sheet, the two tables that we've got in columns A to F and columns H to P, they look like pivot tables, but they're not. If I click into that data, I don't see a pivot tables menu up on the ribbon up here, and I don't see a panel on the right hand side. Plus the fact you can see that all of these cells here contain formulas, and pivot tables don't actually contain formulas. They contain the results of calculations which are done behind the scenes. But essentially this and this are what a typical pivot table would look like. So it is possible to create those kind of reports without building pivot tables. But it's much easier to do it with pivot tables. It's much faster, as you'll see if you stick around. So here you can see that what I have is two things that look very similar to the manual reports. But this and this are pivot tables. How do I know? Because when I click into one of the cells, I get two extra menu options, Pivot Table Analyze and Design. I get a panel on the right hand side of the screen, and I see a value. I see a value in B5, not a formula. So these are pivot tables. On pivot table 2, I have another pivot table. So this particular pivot table, if I click into it, this is showing me the total revenue broken down by location. And within that, we've got a further breakdown based on the product. In our case, it's different flavours of ice cream. And that's showing it in dollar amounts, and it's showing it in percentage. So in other words, Atlanta contributed 13.9% of the entire revenue. And then we have a breakdown of that 13.9% by flavour. And then at the very bottom, we have a grand total. Yes, you could probably do that without a pivot table, but it would take you quite a long time. So pivot tables are great. They allow you to produce reports, but what they do is they do it in a much quicker way. The sheet pivot table 3, that is totally blank. That's where we're going to build some pivot tables to start with. So some of these sheets are totally blank, and I'm going to be building pivot tables there. Some of them have got stuff on for further demos. So let's go back to the sales data. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a fairly simple pivot table that just shows a breakdown of revenue per flavour, and stick that on pivot table 3. I'll just start it in, say, A1 of pivot table 3. So I go back to my sheet with the data on, and I can click anywhere. You can select all the data, but you know, if you had thousands of rows of data, you wouldn't really want to be sitting there selecting it all. So just pick a cell in that data and go to insert on the ribbon and then pivot table, insert pivot table. And it asks you a couple of questions. And as I said, if you are familiar with the Windows version, there's a lot of similarities. There are a few differences. And you know, it could be that you've just bought a Mac. It could be that you prefer a Mac. It could be that you're forced to use a Mac. You know, there's a number of companies, maybe they're Mac only. So, you know, if you do need to build pivot tables on Excel and a Mac's your only option, then stick around. But as I say, what I want to do here is I want to tell it two things. I want to tell it where the data's coming from, and I want to tell it where the pivot table's going. Now, it picks up the data automatically. Most of the time, what it will do is it will say, oh, the cursor's in C12 in this particular example. C12 is part of this big block of data that goes from A5 to G1648. And it's on the sales data sheet. So it's actually made a guess that that is where the data is that I want to build a pivot table from. If it's picked the wrong set of data, and occasionally it will do that, but very rarely, and that's usually because your cursor is in the wrong starting point when you go to insert pivot table, but normally you won't need to change that. But if you do, you can just edit that yourself. Then you need to tell it where to put the pivot table, and we get two choices. We can either put the pivot table onto a new worksheet. So if I left it as the default, it would stick a new sheet down at the bottom, call it sheet 1, and the pivot table would be created there. Or I can select existing worksheet. If I choose existing worksheet, the cursor automatically goes to this table stroke range field, and then I can click on, in this example, pivot 3, and click on A1. You've got to choose a cell. You can't just choose a sheet. You've got to choose a cell and then click OK. If you click OK without choosing a cell, if it just said pivot 3, you get an error. For those who are familiar with Windows, the first thing you'll notice is that doesn't say location, that says table stroke range. So there are minimal visual differences as well. But by and large, very, very similar to the Windows version. So I'll click OK. I also appreciate as well that some people may never have used pivot tables on the Windows version, so I won't keep comparing it to the Windows version. But we get a pivot table placeholder, and we get a panel on the right hand side, and we get the pivot table analyze and design menu. And then to build the pivot table, you drag and drop the column headings from the top section of this panel into filters, columns, rows and values. You don't have to put something in all four of them, you just put something into the appropriate boxes. I also tend to drag this panel down so that I can see more of the column names and less of the boxes. I don't need those 4 boxes to be as tall as they are, so you can just drag that down and resize. So in this case, as I said, I want it to show me the revenue per flavor. So I drag flavor and I drop flavor into rows. And the reason I drop flavor into rows will become evident when I let go of the mouse. And that is because it's listing the flavors from the source data. It's picked up the different flavors and it's listed one occurrence of each in each row. And then I will drag revenue and drop that into values. And the reason I drop revenue to values is because I want it to give me the total revenue. Now what it does is it defaults to a sum. You can see that in two places. You can see it in the heading in B1, you can see it in the values box. And the reason that it's defaulted to a sum, because there are other summaries available, count and average and so on, is that the revenue column that I've picked is a column of numbers. So what it does there is it defaults to a sum. You can't change that, and I'll show you how to do that shortly. So there is a basic pivot table. What I also want to do is I also want to create a second pivot table. So I'm going to go back to my raw data. I'm going to click on a blank cell and go to Insert Pivot Table. I'm going to choose Existing Worksheet. The cursor's gone straight to Table Stroke Range. I'm going to pick Pivot Table 3 again, or Pivot 3 again, go to F1 and click on OK. So I'm going to create another pivot table and stick it in cell F1. And then I'm going to drag in here, I'm going to drag location into rows, and I'm going to drag, what should we have? We'll have containers this time, drag that into values. Now the containers can hold a litre of ice cream. So that is showing me how many litres of ice cream I have sold, or we have sold, broken down by state. What I'm now going to do is I'm now going to add in a second column into the first pivot table. So what I want to do for this first pivot table is I want to see the total revenue per flavour, but I also want to see how many orders there were per flavour. So out of our 1,600 and something rows of data, how many were there for banana, how many were there for chocolate, and so on. Well, to do that, I'm going to drag order ID and drop that below sum of total revenue in the values box. When I let go, it gives me a count. Why does it give me a count and not a sum? Because the order ID column is not numeric. Basically, if you drag a column heading into that values box and it is not numeric, so in this case order ID, order date, flavour, customer location, it defaults to a sum. Sorry, it defaults to a count. Any numerics defaults to a sum. Okay, so that is telling us a breakdown of how many orders there have been per flavour. Now, if I was to drag that count away, so literally drag it out of values and drop it back into the main list, that particular column disappears. So what if I wanted to show a total and a count, but the only column I had in the raw data was, let's say flavour and total revenue? So what I could do there is I could drag a second copy of total revenue and drop that into the values box. Now I've got that in there twice. And if I right click on one of the numbers in column C and select summarize values by, I can change that to a count. I can also choose average, max or min or product, but I can change it to a count. So if you drag a column into the values section, if the column contains text or dates, then it defaults to a count. If you want to make it a count because it's defaulted to a sum, you need to right click on any of the numbers and select summarize values by and change it to count yourself. Okay, so I have a couple of pivot tables. I now want to do a little bit of formatting. So I'm going to change the column headings. First of all, I'm going to go to A1 and just type flavour, and go to B1 and type revenue, and go to C1 and type number of orders. I'm going to go to F1 and type location, and G1 and type number of litres sold. Not spelt like that. No, can't spell that today. Number of litres sold, that's better. Okay, so changing the headings is straightforward. You just go to those cells and type. And now we've got much more explanatory headings. If I want to put those headings aligned to the right, so they line up with the numbers, I can do that and put that heading right aligned. I can change the background colour of any of the cells just in the usual way. So there's no special pivot table formatting for this. You just use standard Excel formatting. Just makes it look a little bit neater. If I want to change the font and the size, I can do that. So just select the cells and then click the drop down arrow and choose the font you want to use. Change the size, change the column widths maybe. If I want to change these to be, say, currency, then I've got a couple of options. I can either select all of them and then click the drop down arrow and go to more number formats, choose currency, and then choose the appropriate currency. So that's one way to do it. Or if I just undo that, I can actually just right click on any of those cells and choose number format. By choosing number format, it applies the formatting to all the cells that are referenced by the revenue over here. So for this one, I'll do number format, go to currency, choose dollar, no decimal places, click OK. And it's applied the dollar formatting to all of those cells. Okay, I'm just going to save the file before I go on. Right, now there are certain operations that you can do within pivot tables that are treated as an update. One of those operations is a sort. So if I was to click into any cell in column B and then right click and select sort largest to smallest, it sorts the pivot table. So that pivot table is now sorted based on the data in column B, not based on the data in column A, which is the default setting. If I want to change it back to sorted alphabetically, right click, sort A to Z. Now if I alter the column widths and then sort again, right click, sort largest to smallest, you'll notice that the column widths jumped back to what's called the auto fit width. The auto fit width means look at the entire column and whatever the widest entry is in that column, set the width of the column to be that. And 9 times out of 10 you don't actually want that, because you have very carefully and deliberately set the columns to be a certain width. It could be so that everything fits on the one screen. It could be maybe you have something down here like a chart and you want the chart to take up a certain size, so you've set the columns accordingly. And then suddenly you do a sort and it changes the column widths back. The other time when the column widths readjust themselves is if you do a refresh, and you can do that in a number of ways. You can do a right click refresh. You can also do data refresh. So that is done, and I'll cover this in detail later, but that is done when the data, the underlying data that pivot table is based on, changes. But I would say, as I said, 9 times out of 10, you don't want the column widths to change. So once you've set them, this is what I would do. I would click anywhere in the pivot table, click on Pivot Table Analyze, click on the Options button, go to the Layout tab, and take the tick out of Auto Fit Column Widths on Update. The Windows version has a similar option. In fact, it has the same option. It's just in a different tab. But if you are familiar with the Windows version of pivot tables, then it's just a case of going to the Layout tab, because they put it in a different place here. It's actually on the first tab on Windows down here. And if you go to the options and then you look at the first tab and you look down here and you can't find the option, then you might panic and think it doesn't exist in the Mac version. Well, it does, but it's under layout. So by taking the tick out of auto fit column widths on update, then what you're saying is anything that performs an update to that pivot table, which is primarily sorting and refreshing, do not adjust the column widths. So if I right click on a cell in column A and select sort A to Z, it sorts the data but leaves the column widths as they are. That is one of those very annoying features of pivot tables, that it by default adjusts the column widths. Okay, so next thing to show you is creating a pivot table with rows and columns, which I'm going to create in pivot table 4. So I'll go back to my data, go to insert pivot table, choose where I want the pivot table to go, click on OK, and then I'm going to drag, for this one, I'm going to drag location to rows, and I'm going to drag flavor to columns, and I'm going to drag revenue to flavor, to values, revenue to values. And there is a pivot table, which is showing me revenue broken down by flavor and location. So how much money did we generate from selling chocolate ice cream to customers based in New York? There's your answer. If you wanted to switch those headings around, you can literally drag and drop them in this panel here. So I could drag flavor to rows and drag location to columns, and it's just changed the structure of the pivot table. So literally just drag it around. I could also align these headings to the right. Let's go to the home tab, align them to the right. I can do all the other changes that I want to. So flavor there, and say location or store location there as a heading. And then if I do want to format all of these as currency, instead of selecting them all, I just right click on one like I showed you before and go to number format and choose whatever format I want to use. But this way it's just a little bit quicker because you don't have to select the cells first. It just applies it to all of the cells that were referenced by the sum of total revenue. Okay, so that's how to do a pivot table where you want to use row headings and column headings. Now I showed you how to do a count. I'll just do another quick example of a count. So go back to my raw data, insert pivot table, stick the pivot table on pivot table 4 and just stick it over in column M, and then drag customer location to rows and pick any column that contains non-numbers. So in this case it will be any column except those three because they're columns with numbers in. So pick any column with non-numbers, so order ID will do, drop it into values, and that gives me a count. So that is telling me how many orders there have been for each location. So if I go to pivot table 5, the pivot table that I've created here is showing the number of customers per store. Actually, what it's showing is the number of orders per store. This is actually a different set of data. So it's actually showing me the same information as this pivot table, but whereas this pivot table is connected to this data here, this pivot table here is connected to a much smaller set of data. So as I said to you before, this particular company, Excellent Ice Creams, they sell their ice creams to their own stores, but they also sell their ice creams to restaurants around the US. They're a supplier to restaurants. So the point I'm making here is we only have 30 rows of data. I'm working on a much smaller data set for this demo. And what that pivot table is showing me is the number of orders per store. The requirement from the boss was the number of customers per store. But with me dragging the customer into the values box and the customer containing text, it's done a count. So it's done nothing different to what I did with this pivot table. So there's 30 rows of data in columns A to D, and the pivot table is showing the 30 rows of data or orders split by location. But as I said, that's not what the boss wants. The boss wants to see the number of unique customers per store. Now, what do I mean by unique? Well, I've highlighted some of the rows that deliberately in the data just to help identify them. So in Atlanta, there are 3 orders, which we can see there, and we can see that there are 3 orders for Atlanta, but they are from 2 different customers, the Maltz Trumpet and the Eastern Oak. And for New York, we have 6 orders, but they are all from the same customer, the Sapphire Saloon. So actually what I want to see for New York is 1, and what I want to see for Atlanta is 2. Now, in the Windows version of Excel, I keep saying that, don't I? In the Windows version of Excel, if you store the source data in the data model instead of the worksheet grid, and if you're not familiar with the data model, I recommend that you go and watch a couple of my other tutorials about Power Pivot and about DAX. But if you store the data in the data model instead of the worksheet grid, and that is the recommended way to do it, creating a pivot table showing the number of unique customers is actually simple. But the problem is the Mac version doesn't support the data model. So we have to do it in a different way. So if I go to E2 and type in a heading that says count, and then type in this formula, which is 1 divided by countif, open brackets, B3 to B32, which is basically all of the customers, and I need to make that absolute with the $signs so that I can copy it down. What's happened there? Just try that again. Equals 1 divided by countif, open brackets, and select B3 to B32, but make that absolute. And then the criteria is what is in B3. So that formula there, what it's going to do, the countif part will count the number of rows for each customer and divide the formula into the number 1, gives fractions that when added together will count 1 entry for each customer. So if I copy that formula down and then give you an example, what we've got is for Atlanta, we've got 0.5, 0.5 and 1, which adds up to 2, and there are 2 customers. 0.16667, and we take 6 of those, adds up to 1. So that is a formula. That formula there is the starting point. I know it's a little bit complex, but that is the formula that we need to use. That's only step 1 though. Copy it down, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit this pivot table here. I'm going to change the pivot table. So instead of picking up data from A to D, it's going to pick up data from A to E. So I need to go to Analyze, Change Data Source, change it so it picks up from A to E. And I then need to drag count and drop that into the values section. And then I need to format these cells to have no decimal places. So let's do that. And there we go. So what that has done is that has given us a unique count. So a unique count is basically saying how many, in this case, unique customers do we have. And we have 1 in New York and we have 2 in Atlanta. So I could have got rid of column H, but I wanted to show you total number of orders and total number of customers. So that's actually number of orders, and that one is number of customers. And then I could actually hide column E. I don't need to see that. The pivot table still works. Okay, so that is a workaround, or a dirty hack as we like to call it, for being able to do a unique count in the Mac version of Excel. Now Peter says, do I ever use shortcut keys? I do occasionally, Peter, yeah, but not a great deal. I'm a mouse and keyboardy person. Or more of a mousy person than a keyboardy person, but I do use the odd occasional one. Okay, do we have any other questions at this point? If you want to put questions in, as I said, please put your questions and comments into the chat panel. All right, let us move on then. So the next thing I'm going to show you, let me know if you found that little hack useful as well. I know it's a little bit more complex than just going and doing a right click as you would in Windows and say summarize values by and then choosing distinct count. But that is the best way to do it. So basically I'll just go and show you that again. I'll have to unhide column E. So the formula there is doing a 1 divided by COUNTIF, and then the range, which is the first parameter of the COUNTIF, is all the cells in the column that's got the customer in it, and the second parameter is the cell that's got the customer in it for this row. Then you need to copy the formula down, and then you just include that column in the pivot table. And as I found, I needed to also change the number of decimal places to 0. So as long as you've got that formula there, and what I'll do is I'll just leave it on screen for a second in case anybody wants to note it down. In fact, can I can put it in the chat if anybody wants a copy of it. I'll stick it in the chat. There we go. Okay. Right, so let's move on, and the next thing we'll move on to is filtering. So let's look at filtering. Okay, so I have a pivot table here which is showing me total revenue and total number of orders for each state. And what I want to do is I want to see just LA, New York and Seattle. Those are the 3 states that I, as sales manager, am responsible for. So I click the drop down arrow in A1, because you only have one drop down arrow for the entire pivot table. You don't have drop down arrows on each column. So click the drop down arrow in A1, take the tick out of select all and select the ones that I'm interested in, which was LA, New York and Seattle. And as soon as I've done that, it applies the filter. I can either leave this filter panel visible and just move it out of the way, or I can close it down. So then, if I want to change my filter values, I could clear the select all box again and choose, say, Houston and Chicago. So it's really easy to apply filtering, particularly if this dialog box is left visible. That is actually one thing that the Windows version doesn't do. It doesn't let you actually leave this dialog box visible. So every time you want to apply a filter, you have to click on the arrow or the filter button. But you can actually leave this visible and just move it around any way you want to. If I want to then clear the filter, I can either click the clear filter button or I can just put a tick in select all. And that clears the filter. Okay, but what if I wanted to, let's say, apply a filter based on number of orders? So I want to show all of the locations where the number of orders was less than 230. I need to bring back the filter dialog, and I need to create a value filter. The reason you set up a value filter is because we're filtering on one of the columns with numbers in. So set up a value filter where it says choose one. I'm going to choose less than, and then I'm going to choose the hang on a minute, less than. I need to choose the number of orders. Just bear with me a second. Come out of that, click into column C first, and choose again by value, less than, let's say 230. And that doesn't appear to have worked. Let's change that to number of orders. That hasn't worked either. Okay. Why isn't this working? Okay, I will come back to that later. But as I said, the filtering that normally you would do would be on the first column. So let's click the drop down and do it again. Just clear the ticks and select just the locations that I'm interested in. Okay, another thing that you can do, by the way, is you can double click on a cell with a number in it, and what that does is that creates a new sheet just to the left of the one that you were in, and it gives you all the details based on the cell that you double clicked on. So if I double click on the 225, which is for New York, what it does is it sticks a new sheet in just to the left of the cell, the sheet with the pivot table in, and that is giving me a breakdown just for New York, because it was the New York one that I double clicked on. So if I go back to another pivot table with more data in it, let's say this one, and I double click on that cell there, which is the revenue for sales of lemon ice cream to Nashville, that now is giving me a new sheet just to the left of pivot 4, which is giving me a breakdown showing me just sales of lemon ice cream to customers based in Nashville. So that is a kind of filter, because you are drilling down, you're filtering based on a particular value, but it's quite a nice thing to have. Okay, so that is filtering. Oh, that is filtering. So we'll leave filtering there. But moving on to a new kind of filter is slicers. So slicers allow you to do filtering, but in a much more modern, much more visual way. So what I've shown you there with the drop down arrow works, but it's a kind of old style filter, whereas what I'm going to show you now is a much more modern way of doing a filter. Okay, so slicers. Let's say what I wanted to do was filter that first pivot table by state. So I want to be able to see revenue per product, but I want to be able to look at it per state. Same with the second pivot table and the third pivot table. So I want to see revenue per flavour, number of orders per flavour, and cost per flavour, but I want to do it based on state. Now, I don't have any way of filtering by state in these pivot tables. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the state, or customer location as it is here. I'm going to add the customer location and drop that into filters. And then click on this drop down here, and that will give me a list of the locations. So if I take the tick out of select all and I select Los Angeles, what I'm now looking at is I'm now looking at a breakdown of revenue per flavour just within orders for LA. But the other two pivot tables are showing me all the orders and all the orders. So if I wanted to do the same thing, if I wanted to show revenue orders per flavour for LA, I would need to drag customer location into filters and set the filter to LA and do the same thing for this pivot table. So customer location, and put that in there. That, of course, because it's inserted two columns up here, that has now pushed these charts down. So let's just insert a blank column, and if I then clear the formatting, that then just gives us a little bit of space between the pivot table and the chart. But let's say then I want to look at the information for New York. So I then have to go back here and choose New York, then go to here and choose New York, and go to here and choose New York. In fact, I didn't even choose LA for that one, did I? Because I got distracted by needing a blank row. So my point is, I'm having to create a filter for each pivot table, and then I have to apply that filter to each pivot table, and it just gets a little bit messy. But with a slicer, I can create basically one filter and attach it to all the pivot tables. So the first thing I'll do is I'll go into this pivot table and I will remove the filter. In fact, before I do that, I want to actually clear the filter so I see all the data, and then drag customer location out of the filter box. Do the same thing for this pivot table, clear the filter so that I can see all of the data, and remove the filter, and do the same thing for this pivot table. Clear the filter and then remove the filter. And I could also remove those two blank lines if I wanted to. So to create a slicer, you select one cell in any of the pivot tables. It doesn't matter which pivot table I use, because ultimately all three pivot tables will be connected to the one slicer. So I'll just pick the first pivot table and go to Analyze, Insert Slicer. Analyze, Insert Slicer. It then asks me to choose which column I want to attach the slicer to, and in this case it's customer location, and click OK. And there is my slicer. So basically the slicer is a visual filter. It's a set of buttons, and each button contains, in this case, a customer location. It's in concept, it's the same as the drop-down filter that we looked at before on row 1, but it just does it in a much more visual way. So I'll drag the slicer out of the way. That's the other thing, a slicer can be positioned anywhere, whereas the filters that we added before had to appear above the pivot tables. And now when I click a button like LA, it applies a filter automatically. So it's only applied it to this pivot table, but what I'm seeing is I'm seeing the revenue per flavour just for LA. If I click on New York, it changes the numbers because it's showing me the figures just for New York. If I want to clear the filter, then click that button at the top right, and that just clears the filter and selects everything. Now I just see that Peter said, can you right click and remove the filters? So what you're saying, Peter, is if I dragged customer location into there, it's brought it back. But if I right click where it says customer location, yeah, I can just say remove field and then it's gone. So yes, that is another way to do it. So you've actually got two ways. You can right click, or you can just drag it out of the filters box and drop it back in the main list. Okay, so we've got, and now I've need to move this pivot table up. Well, I don't need to move the pivot table up, but I will if I want them to look consistent, and it's not letting me do that. Why isn't it letting me do that? How very odd. Because I've removed the filter, so it should let me... okay, what if I actually delete those 2 rows? Delete cells, shift everything up. No, it likes that. Why didn't it like me just dragging up the pivot table? I don't know. Anyway, I was only doing that so that everything looks even, but now this chart needs moving down. There we go. Okay, Peter, I won't make you feel incredibly guilty for asking that question and everything going to pot in terms of the appearance, but never mind, I've sorted now. Right, so the next thing I want to do is I want to connect that slicer to the other 2 pivot tables, so that when I choose a location, it actually changes the numbers on all 3 pivot tables, rather than having 3 slicers. Because if I was going to have 3 slicers, I might as well have had 3 filters up here. So if I click onto that slicer, I go to the slicer menu and I go to report connections. And what report connections does is it gives me a list of all the pivot tables in this file, and there's a lot of them, and it then breaks it down by sheet. Now, I know that we're looking at the sheet called slicers. So if I tick the other 2 pivot tables that are on the slicer sheet, I've now connected that slicer to the 3 pivot tables in here, and click OK. I'll let you off in that case, Peter. So now if I click on one of these locations, what it's doing is it's now applying the filter to all 3 pivot tables. So I can click on a slicer button and it changes the numbers in column B, the numbers in column F, and the numbers in column J. If I want to clear the filter, and then as I showed you before, I just click on the button up at the top here to clear the filter. And if I want to select more than one location, I click on the first location, hold the control key down and click on the other locations. It's actually the command key in on the Mac. On Windows it's the control key, on the Mac it's the command key. So hold the command key down whilst clicking the other locations, and if you click the command key on one that is if you click whilst holding the command key on one that is selected, then it deselects it. So now when I let go of the command key, I'm now looking at the figures for 3 customer locations, and then clear the filter totally. The other things you can do with slicers are you can change the colours. So you've got a number of different colours that you can pick from, like that. And you can also have the buttons in multiple columns, like that. So instead of having 1 column of buttons, I could have 2 columns or 3 columns, and then just resize the slicer accordingly, like that. So you're talking about a neat option there in the chat, Peter. I presume you're talking about the ability to select multiple items just by clicking on one of them, holding command down and clicking on the others to select multiple items. Another way to do that is, see the button just to the left of the clear filter, the multi-select. If you actually turn that on by clicking it, it's an on-off toggle. If you turn it on, it was on, then by default they're all selected, and you just click without holding anything down to deselect and then click it off. It's actually difficult to see whether it's on or off sometimes. So it's on, and then you have to clear the filter totally and then click it again. Yeah, it's sometimes it can be difficult to tell whether it's on or off. There we go, it's off now. So when it's on, when that is on, it means that you don't need to hold anything down. Oh, the connectivity issue. Yeah, the connectivity is really handy. I thought you were talking about selecting multiple items because that's really useful as well. But yeah, the connectivity. So you just click on the slicer and click on report connections, and you can even connect the slicer to pivot tables that are on a different sheet, which is really useful as well. Another question that comes up is, what about the names of the pivot tables? Well, if you click on a pivot table and you click on the Analyze tab, it actually shows you the pivot table name on the left hand side. If you want to rename the pivot table, you can do. But at least if you know which pivot table is which, just by clicking in the pivot table and looking up here on the left hand side of the Analyze ribbon, you can see which pivot table is which. And then connect your single slicer to multiple pivot tables. Okay, charts. If you know how to create normal charts, then pivot table charts are not that different. There's a couple of small differences. One difference is that when you create a normal chart, you have to select all the data before clicking on Insert and choosing your chart type. With a pivot table, because a pivot table uses all the data for the chart, you just have to be in the pivot table and then click on Insert, choose the type of chart you want to create, and that creates a chart from the pivot table data. It automatically uses all the data in the pivot table. If you apply a filter, then it will filter the chart. So let's just pick 3 flavors and it's applied the filter to the chart. Let's select all and it clears the filter from the chart. But if I went back to, say, pivot table, there we go. If I go back to pivot 3 and I created a pivot table chart from this pivot table here, so Insert Chart, what it's done is it's automatically created a chart from the data in column B and the data in column C. So it's not so simple to just say, I want to create a chart from the data that's in column A and column C, because it will automatically include column B, and it does that on Windows as well. Okay, now one thing, if you are familiar with pivot charts on Windows, one thing it doesn't do here is it doesn't give you the 2 buttons. It doesn't give you the button up here and the button up here, which, to be honest, is actually a blessing, because 9 times out of 10 you go up to the Analyze menu on Windows and you hide those buttons because they're not particularly useful. So the Mac version doesn't even give you the options for those buttons. The number of times that I've gone and I've been running a pivot tables training session and I've said, okay, we need to clear these buttons by going up to Analyze, and somebody's put in the chat and said, I don't have those buttons, and it's, you must be on a Mac. Okay, so that is how to create a pivot chart from your data. The rest of the stuff on the chart would be the same as if it was just a standard chart. So if you want to put a title in, or if you want to change the colors or remove the legend or something like that, then that is just the same as if you were building a standard chart. Okay, so a couple more things to cover. I'm going to close this file down, and I'm going to open up a file called a data model. Because one of the questions that I often get asked from Mac users is, what if I wanted to create a pivot table from multiple data sets? So I've created multiple data sets. For the moment, just ignore columns E and F. I've got here a list of employees, their name, their grade, and their location. And on sheet 2, I've got another table which shows the office names, which is exactly the same as the office names here, along with the region. And here on sheet 3, I've got the grades along with the salaries. So I've broken my data down into 3 separate tables. And what if I wanted to create this pivot table here, which shows total revenue by region? Well, the problem I've got is that region is not in this data here. Region is in this data here, and revenue is in, salary, not revenue, salary is in this data here. What if I wanted to know how many employees were on each grade? Well, the grades are here and the data is here for counting the names. So I could actually create this pivot table from that data. That's not a problem. But what if I wanted to see a breakdown of salary per grade? Then I'd have a problem, because the salaries are in one table and the number of people with the grades, which is going to determine the total salaries, is in another. There is no way to do this easily in the Mac version like there is in the Windows version, because in the Windows version I would just store the 3 sets of data in the data model, connect them together using common fields, which is how you create relationships, and then build a pivot table based on the data in the data model. But as I said before, the Mac version doesn't support the data model. Whether it ever will do, I don't know. So what I've had to do is I've had to create lookup formulas in here and lookup formulas in here, and then the 3 pivot tables are based on that range there. So it is a little bit of a hack. It's how you used to have to do it in the Windows version before Excel 2013, which is when Microsoft brought the data model in. And the only downside is, with a lot of data, you could see a performance issue, because XLOOKUPs, VLOOKUPs are notorious for causing slowdowns in the running of the file. So it's just something to be aware of. But at the moment, that really is the only way to do it. There is actually another way, and that is to use Power Query. But at the moment, Power Query is still only in beta on the Mac version of Excel. Okay, so that was just a little bit about the data model, because I get asked about that on a regular basis. The other one I wanted to mention before we start wrapping up is refreshing the data. So what happens when the data updates? So here I have 3 pivot tables which are showing how many starters, how many main course, how many dessert we need for a meal that we are organising for the team. And let's say that Sue decides that she would like to have soup instead of salad. And Peter decides he will have chicken instead of steak. And Alex decides he will have toffee pie, or her will have toffee pie instead of ice cream. So I've gone and I've changed the data, but it has not updated the pivot tables. And that's because pivot tables do not automatically update when the underlying data changes. If you want those pivot tables to update when that data has changed, then what you need to do is either go to the pivot table and click Analyze Refresh, or click anywhere and click Data Refresh All. I usually go for Data Refresh All because 1, it's quicker, and 2, you don't have to click in a pivot table, because you need to be in a pivot table to bring up the Analyze menu. So if I do Data and then Refresh All, it has now updated the 3 pivot tables. It has also changed the column widths, because I haven't set the Do Not Adjust the Column Widths on those 3 pivot tables. So that is what you do to refresh. But the problem is, if you added more data, that would not help you. So if I just added some more data, so John wanted pate and steak and ice cream. But if I do a refresh, that is not going to update the pivot tables, because the pivot tables are all pointing to A1 to D15. So what I would need to do is I would need to go to Analyze, Change Data Source, and change the data source to look at D15, and then do the same thing with that pivot table and do the same thing with that pivot table. Change the data source to point to the correct range. And then it automatically updates. Okie dokie, we are almost done. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully you have found that to be a useful session, showing you how to create pivot tables. If you've never done it before, hope you've found that useful. If you've used the Windows version before and maybe you are just curious, or maybe you actually have a need to create pivot tables on the Mac, I hope you have seen the differences. So if you've liked what you've seen, please give it a like on YouTube, just underneath the video. Click the like button. If you're not subscribed to my channel, please subscribe. We like subscribers. If you want to contact me, my contact details are there. But I hope you found that useful. If we have any questions, then I'm more than happy to take questions. I've taken questions during the session. So if anybody has any more questions before we finish, then please put them into the chat. If you're watching this on a replay and you want to ask a question, then there again are my contact details. You can drop me an email. You can go to the exceltrainer.co.uk and contact me via the contact form. But if we have no more questions, then I will say what I always say at the end of my videos, and that is, have an excellent day. Thanks everybody, take care, and we will chat again.